D&D players and DMs of Reddit, what's your best okay, I'll allow it story? The party was in the dungeons of a castle, and the dungeons were full of wraiths that we needed to kill, because they would drop magic skulls needed to complete a puzzle, something we didn't realize until later. The rogue had a bag of devouring in his possession. He held it open, grabbed one of the wraiths, and forced it into the bag. DM eloquently describes the occurrence as a screeching, followed by a crunching sound coming from the bag. Fast forward to when we actually need these skulls, party is struggling hard trying to figure out this puzzle. We try everything up to and including smashing the skulls, which the DM says are indestructible. DM finally hints that we're missing a skull. We realize that it was going to be the skull dropped by the wraith that was shoved into the bag. We crack open the D&D manuals and read up on bags of devouring, and the DM reads aloud that any creature that ends its turn inside the bag is devoured and all traces of it are consumed. We respond with, but you said the skulls were indestructible. DM pauses a moment and says, the skull falls out of the bag and we cheer in triumph. My cousin joined our group for a single session. We set him up with a solid character for his one-shot adventure, figured the group would enjoy traveling with a generous, heavily armed veteran. He ends up wrestling a hostile wizard to the ground. He had thought to negate the spellcasting by tackling him, all in all not a terrible idea. His grapple checks went better than expected and he decides he can end the fight himself, so he says I pull out my garrote and strangle the fool. I remember his character sheet fairly well, I wrote the damn thing. Where did you find a garrote? You said yourself this character came with a brand new robe of useful things. A garrote is a useful thing, ergo I have one. Okay, I will allow it. The party was in a theater, so they didn't have their weapons. They were looking for someone infected by a heart shard of fear, and they eventually found it. A battle ensued. The Goliath barbarian said he'll pick up a couch from the set and smash it into the enemy. I've always been a rule of cool DM, so I said fuck it, sure. He rolled high, so I allowed the couch to deal 2d10 damage. It also broke to pieces in the process. The time when the barbarian smashed a couch into a wraith is still one of the high moments of that campaign. My group was adventuring in a crypt and came across some ritual oil. We took it, thinking we may need to create some kind of explosion to clear the way ahead. Our barbarian, with 18 strength, was the one carrying it. Even put some rope into them to make them like giant Molotov cocktails. We get down a little further into the crypt and find a coffin sealed with a heavy stone top. Barbarian puts the oil down to push the top off and, unsurprisingly, gets jumped by a vampire. Barbarian rolled poorly on initiative, but one of the other team members used their round to ignite the rope. Cue the light bulb for the barbarian. His turn finally comes around, he grapples the vampire, which is a feat in and of itself, and suplexes him directly into the urn. Lots of fire damage for both of them. In a game of Call of Cthulhu, think D&D, but Lovecraftian and set in the real world in the 1920s, my players were hunting down a wizard who had switched bodies with a college student, and was now going around town killing the descendants of those who originally imprisoned him. The adventure is called The Condemned for any fellow keepers. They had managed to steal a book from the wizard's lair and leave a message to meet them at a nearby airfield, to negotiate terms to trade the book for giving the student's body back. The investigators intended to betray him, however, and capture him with the help of the local PD. Little did they know the wizard was planning a surprise for them. They have a day or so to get ready for the meeting, so one of my players, who was a former Great War fighter pilot, asked if he could call his mechanic to prep up his plane and fly it down to Arkham, the town they were in. The player had rolled pretty well on his credit rating skill, which determines affluence, so I figured it wasn't unreasonable for him to have maybe owned the plane he used in the war or bought it afterwards. He then says, "Oh, and Frank, go ahead and mount up the Browning while you're at it." I got a bad feeling about this meet. That's when the player, and the rest of the table, gives me the look. The look that says, is he going to go along with it? I decided that, yes, your character does have a machine gun mounted to his plane. I'll even throw in a few crates of ammo to boot. The reason I allowed it was because the wizard had a spell called Summon/Bind Hunting Horror that I really wanted to use on my players, but felt it was a little too unfair. What followed was a glorious battle that was by far one of my favorite times running a game. A motorcycle chase, a player being swallowed whole, while wearing a ring granting immunity to kinetic damage in exchange for her sanity, with the intent of shooting it from the inside, a dogfight between an airplane and basically a dragon, with the cherry on top being the pilot catching the swallowed player on the wing of his plane after banishing the horror back to its plane of existence. What a fucking evening. Later on they just ended up shooting the wizard in the back with both barrels of a sawed-off shotgun. We were playing a 4-year-long campaign where the Undercity was trying to take over the surface realm. Our rogue, who was leaving the group strapped on every magic item he had at his disposal, gave the cleric a kiss and stepped through his portable gateway to the Undercity. He had a few scrolls of haste and a cursed object that would cause all items to explode if exposed to haste. He planned it for months and turned himself into a huge magic bomb, destroying the whole Undercity. The rogue wasn't the only thing killed. Rip my inbox. My party was going up against a Medusa who had already petrified our paladin. Our barbarian had an idea. He covered himself with some old armor that had belonged to the Medusa's long-dead husband. Barbarian barges in booming, "I have possessed this mortal body, my love." Our DM said she would allow it with a high enough persuasion check. Alas, our barbarian has cursed dice. We found a ruined palace in the jungle and ended up killing the queen who lived there. She was a Gorgon/Medusa, so it was a hard fight, and we were looking forward to looting her place when we won, but since all the valuables were corroded or stolen long ago, there was no actual treasure to be had. Over her dead body, I said, and cut her head off to keep as a trophy. Fast forward to when we're running through a ruined city with a giant froghemoth stomping after us. Well, I was playing a necromancer cleric and, after getting the DM to allow it, pulled the Gorgon's head out of my pack, held it toward the Titan, and resurrected it with all the unholy power I could muster. It blasted out a ray of petrification like a perfect reenactment of Perseus saving Andromeda, and blistered its flesh to stone through several rounds of sustained casting. The head was deteriorated to useless shreds after channeling so much energy, but the froghemoth was defeated, and it was such an epic moment. Too good not to post. This was probably 10 years ago, so details are a wee bit fuzzy. We were playing a campaign as a group of friends for the first time, with a couple of new players. As we build our characters, one of our friends decides she's going to play as a halfling. She decided that as part of the standard kit, she had a bucket and rope, so she spent all her money having spikes added to the bucket, and tying the rope onto it. A boat. A grappling hook. A drinking/bathing vessel. A flail. A helmet. An elevator. It was all these things, and possibly more. It was literally her multi-tool in the campaign, and became a huge joke of how she was going to use the bucket in any difficult situation. It was a ton of fun. The DM let it go, but he had to do some hard figuring to determine its characteristics and roles and all that. And then he killed us all. Not right away, but after many sessions, when one of our friends led us down a path he didn't want us to go down, and we kept finding ways through his challenges. I only just got back into D&D. Not a DM, just witness to god tier levels of luck. My buddies and I play a Fallout D&D campaign, and we have 2 different campaigns going right now. At the very start of the second one, we woke up in a rundown factory. We encountered a sentry knot that was not hostile unless we entered a certain room. My buddy decided that he wanted to hack the bot to turn into a companion. Our DM said he needed to roll intelligence, science, and repair. Natural 20s for all 3, and we pretty much broke the campaign because the sentry bot deals fucking insane damage. On our first D&D session ever, one of our buddies asked our more experienced DM if he could be 4 detective penguins stacked on top of each other wearing a trench coat, each with differing abilities that you could swap between every turn depending on the penguin who was on top. Each one also happened to be named after the penguins of Madagascar. Our DM was more than happy to allow it. A friend of mine convinced our DM to let him play a Minotaur who was raised by gnomes and thought he was gnome. My friend wanted to lick the floor for research purposes as a barbarian. The DM said sure, YTF not roll for insight, and he got a nat 20. Apparently that nat 20 allowed him to notice the 3 monsters that were about 120-ish feet in front of us. BTW, it was in a cave. Shadowrun player got himself extra character points by taking the floor where he had traumatic flashbacks triggered by chocolate eclairs flying through the air. His reasoning was that this would be so unlikely to happen, the floor was free points. Probably having a bit of fun with it and not seriously power gaming. But he got me as a GM. Pastries. Pastries everywhere. Witchard and D. Found a water hag guarding a chest of heirlooms and wearing some we were to recover. Through various hints and lore, I ended up voicing my concern that the water hag may have been the wife of the man who sent us to recover it, considering she'd died and they couldn't even find her body. My DM looked at her notes, put some papers away and motioned for us to go on. The whole encounter was supposed to be an epic fight, but we managed to break through to her reason, have an emotional conversation, and end her life quickly when she asked us to. Spoke to her ghost as well and promised to pass on her love to her husband and son. A few lucky rolls and some creativity, and we had one of the best encounters of our campaign. Had a few good rounds as a PC where I managed to convince my DM to let me carry a full-sized door around with me jig. We used it to escape down a hill via tobogganing and crashed into a lake away from the goblin horde chasing after us. Had another PC who had enchanted everlasting chalk convinced the DM that he, the character who left the table, gave it to me. Came in handy when we entered an enchanted maze that seemed to be spiraling in a downward. Wasn't until the chalk lines lining up that we realized we were stuck in an enchantment loop. I was playing as a monk and I decided a part of the character would be to try to convert other characters into monks as often as possible. The party had entered a cave and the DM had a horde of 5 goblins attack us. My character knew goblin as a language, along with orc, since I thought it would be funny to have my character know those languages, and I told the DM I wanted to try convincing the goblins to become monks. He allowed it and I rolled a nat 20, so what was supposed to be one of the 2 main fights for that session ended up just making it so we had a small army of goblin monks for the rest of the session. In the process 2 died, and the DM not wanting to deal with me having 5 turns per fight, myself, a bandit I had already made into a monk in the previous session, and the 3 surviving goblins, forced me to drop them off at a monastery so they could properly train as monks. So we were fighting a lick at the end of the campaign. We were 9 incredibly overpowered experienced players who min-maxed the hell out of their characters. So the DM decided to make this mean as possible. He gave the Lich a sphere of annihilation. For those who do not know, If you are touched by the sphere, you instantly cease to exist. There's no saving throw or roll. If it enters your space, you cease to exist. You don't die, you cease to exist, so no resurrection. So the Lich killed 6 of us in a handful of turns. That was when the fighter and the rogue turned to each other and said, "We are going to sacrifice ourselves by grappling it and pushing the Lich into the sphere of annihilation." So, they grappled him. Leeches have terrible strength, and then suplexed him into the sphere. DM reads the sphere's item description and realized it's only a few feet in diameter, so they both made their saving throws and survived. Edit for those doubting the story, this is Tomb of Annihilation, where there's kind of an entire subplot of disintegration items. I don't know if the DM altered the item, but the other players seemed familiar with it. Edit 2, yeah, looks like the DM changed it. This was the only way the fight would have been remotely challenging. We would have completely destroyed him otherwise. Allowing me to play the character in the first place. He was a half-ogre fighter who was raised by an order of paladins. He believed he was also a paladin, so much it manifested in some very limited psionic abilities. Cellular adjustment for laying on hands, aura alteration, so he always read as lawful good paladin, etc. etc. His war steed was an ox. His squire was a kobold, he just went along to steal treasure. He was so dumb he once got a ring of flying and couldn't figure out how to get down. My players were just starting their adventure, so they were maybe level 2 at most when this happened. They were doing a dungeon I had designed to be revisited many times in the story, and as usual, these idiots unintentionally got into one of the much more dangerous high-level areas I had planned for months down the road. There's a huge underground lake inside this dungeon with something nasty, and completely optional, in its depths. They spend like a week in-game on one little shore near the lake, camping, and preparing and planning. One of the 2 fighters had taken mostly crafting skills and ends up building a boat, while the other much more reckless fighter is climbing cave walls like a lunatic trying to do God knows what. The druid starts filling the boat with any kind of poison and flammable he can get his hands on, and they send it out to the middle of this lake. The Sork lights it on fire, and the batshit fighter is at the top of the cave knocking down stalactites. Long story short, these assholes killed a goddamn 6k HP kraken with a flaming poisonous boat. At level 2. Was DM, players were playing in a world that was strictly controlled by an inquisitorial-like government. Magic was outlawed. Player insisted on playing a wizard. I warned him that there are strict penalties for magic use, but with a little role-playing he can convince the people that it's all divine miracles and whatnot. He does well for a while keeping up the ruse. The big giant battle comes and it's winding downish. Players are confronting the uprising of the downcast magic using and magical creatures and defend the city, but the party's wizard slips and casts, not Holy Bolt, not Divine Judgment, not Miracle Spear, but Magic Missile, killing the leader of uprising. However, this did not sit well with their paladin. He says, "I attack the evil wizard." Me, but the wizard is dead. Oh shit. Paladin at 20. Me roll damage, I guess. Edit, so this has inspired some conversation and some horror stories below. It's never okay to be a bully, period, but especially in an escapist hobby like RPGs. Wizard knew he fucked up as soon as he cast the spell. The rest of the party knew he fucked up as soon as he cast the spell. This wasn't a snap decision by the paladin to roflcopter another player. Context is important, and the paladin is a paladin in a theocratic anti-magical society. I thought it was great role-playing for him to follow his order at the expense of his newfound friend. The paladin captured the wizard and he had to stand trial. It led to some really great role-playing, and the wizard may or may not have been the catalyst for the revolution that toppled the theocracy. Was a player in a campaign where we managed to acquire a bag of holding. My character was the one carrying said bag, and I quickly got into the habit of asking the DM, does it fit in the bag of holding? About pretty much every single thing we found. Weapons, armor, interesting furniture, statues. If it caught my eye in any way, I inquired as to fitting it into the bag of holding. Eventually we had to get to an island in a lake, so we found a rowboat and rowed across. After getting to the island, my character looked at the rowboat and, of course, asked if it would fit in the bag of holding. The DM, a little exasperated with me at his point, said something along the lines of you know what. Sure. The damn boat fits in the bag of holding. It shouldn't, but it does. You now have a boat in a bag. Congratulations. At this time I had precisely zero plans for the boat, but since the DM said it would fit, into the bag it went. Then we started exploring the tomb on the island that was the whole reason for the boat ride in the first place. The DM was annoyed with all of us because we kept, deliberately, if I'm being honest, derailing the main story and trying to go in every direction except the one we needed to, so he set up one room in the tomb to be our punishment. We got to the entrance of the room and our rogue checked for traps. He rolled pretty high. The DM then gleefully described to us how the walls were covered with holes, and since the rogue had rolled well enough he could tell they were arrow traps. Literally hundreds of arrow traps, lining every inch of every wall in the room. It would probably have taken the rest of the session just for the rogue to roll all the disabled trap checks. We wanted to clear the entire tomb and the only path forward was through that room. We had spent a few minutes debating how we could get past this bit of DM sadism when I had an idea. I looked at the DM and said, "Here pulls the rowboat out of the bag of holding." The DM, and the rest of the party, gave me their best "what the fuck are you doing" stares. She turns the boat upside down. Continued staring. She climbs underneath the boat. The DM sighed heavily and dropped his face into his hands as the party all huddled together and just walked through the arrow trap room under the rowboat, shielded from the DM's traps by the very thing the DM had allowed me to put in the bag of holding. In another campaign I rolled a crit that made the same DM so salty that he instituted a house rule to prevent it from happening again. I miss that gaming group. It was a lot of fun. I'm both a D&D player and DM, so I'll tell my favorite one, when I was a player in this story. TL, Doctor, our bard makes Archdevil his sugar daddy and kills almost everyone as they rule over everything. Some friends and I were playing in a friend's campaign. We were fighting the archdevils and demons. There were 8 of us with the party looking like a rogue, 2 clerics, 1 life, and me as a war cleric, 3 wizards, necromancy, evocation, and divination, followed with a bard and a tempest barbarian. We were all level 18, and were getting close to the beg Asmodeus. The way he had it working was that we had to defeat all the other archdevils that rule 1 layer of hell, to get to Asmodeus, who is on the last level. So we were in the 5th layer when the ruler, Levistius, appeared and attacked us. We were losing the fight cause he kept in summoning many weaker devils. The bard though knows that he killed Asmodeus's wife out of passion. The rogue tries to, in the middle of the battle, convince Levistius to help us kill Asmodeus so he can revive the women he killed. The rogue failed. Then the bard did what bards always do. He tried to make Levistius his sugar daddy. And succeeded due to some items and a few good rolls, to which the DM says, "Well, this is your guys' last session for the campaign and thos were the best rolls of the night so far, so I will allow it and you can't do it again." Now we have a ruler of hell as our bard's sugar daddy. When we finally reach Asmodeus, our bard gets Levistius, who was imprisoned by Asmodeus, to fight him to the death for his love. Levistius obviously dies, and a weakened Asmodeus gets killed, as well as our divination wizard and barbarian. The life cleric, who is now level 20, starts reviving our dead teammates when the bard asks if he can revive Levistius, to which the cleric agrees. After Levistius is revived, he kills all but the bard and they proceed to attack the material plane and rule it. Pathfinder player here. The spell Aboleth's Lung allows you to breathe underwater, but removes your ability to breathe air. Basically, you respirate like a fish, you need water. Beg fight. I am a mostly useless druid, but I have this spell prepared. It's not a combat spell, but what the hell, I ask the DM. He says I'll need to be able to meet Beg's touch AC for it to work. Nat 20. What was supposed to be a huge, difficult fight ended very abruptly. We looted the room and carried on to better things. Edit, here's a bonus story that went the other way hilariously. Our rogue had taken the river rat feat, so he was supposed to be a great swimmer. He made no secret of it either. So we got to a moat somewhere that required a skill check. We all made it through, but our rogue rolled 3 fucking critical fails in a row and almost drowns. It was awesome. I know some people hate fourth, but I was doing for a group at work, and wanted to get started quickly. It was with a bunch of people who had never played before, but did play an awful lot of video games. I ran the Kobold Cave Adventure from the DMG, the one with the Skull Room. Well, they got to the Skull Room, and the kobolds were not happy, but a couple of them spoke Draconic and had high charisma and social skills. They wanted to trick the kobolds. And the whole group was up for it. They convinced the kobolds that they were here as part of the new official Sword Coast-wide Skull League. And they played a game of Skull with the kobolds. Yes, I made up rules on the spot for playing Skull. The players won and convinced the kobold team that by league rules they now had to leave the arena so the winning team could celebrate. I had the kobolds leave the way the players had come in. Effectively, they beat the room by talking and playing Skull. There are some other stories, of course, a lot from Shadowrun that are hilarious, but the traveling Skull team was just really awesome and fun for me, especially with a group of new players.